Our first panel today includes Brad, who is with the Edison Electric Institute, Ron with Energy Innovation, and Ashok with NRDC. They're here to discuss securitization and coal plant retirements. So we'll have the presentations, we'll ask some questions, and please use your Q&A box at the top there to ask any questions both during and at the end of the session. So with that, Brad, if you wouldn't mind, take it away.
Excellent. All right. Can you hear me? I think
You're great.
All set. All right, cool. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to come and speak a little bit on a topic that is really, I guess, increasing in import. This is a conversation that we're being asked at EEI, and EEI is the trade association for all the investor-owned electric companies. We're being asked about it on pretty much a daily basis. And so I wanted to just run through a little bit of what securitization is, what this tool is, and what it isn't, and some of the things that we think should be considered as you consider what to do with existing coal plants. So if you could progress to the next slide, please. So here are my goals. What is securitization? How and where has it been utilized by electric companies? It's a useful tool, but it's not a panacea. And then as you're considering replacing any facility, we believe that stakeholder conversations about both the replacement and reliability should be a part of the going forward plan. Next slide, please. All right, so this is case law. This is the regulatory compact. These are sort of foundational pieces of the Supreme Court cases that determined this construct that we call the regulatory compact. The regulatory compact and authority for electric companies' ability to beat regulated monopolies lies in really these three cases: Binghamton Bridge, Hope, and Bluefield. And as you can read the words on the screen, this is really how we were able to construct the electric business that we operate under today. This construct, this regulatory compact has been utilized to build out and finance our nation's electric generation, transmission, and distribution system. This construct was the enabler of the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, which allowed for all citizens to have access to electricity no matter where they live. This is really, in my mind at least, the original public-private partnership. It allows this allows private capital to be invested under the direction of state government, who works with a group of energy investors to determine what resources are needed to meet today's demands and future demands. The resource decisions that are made in and around electric companies are 30, 40, or 50-year investments. And I think as we think about some of these coal plant retirement decisions that are being made kind of all across the country, we have to remember that the investments were made 30, 40, 50 years ago were made in good faith with all of the information that we had at the time, understanding what we expected population growth to be, understanding what customer demands were like. Customer demands have shifted pretty rapidly over the last decade or so, and frankly, both the electric industry, a lot of the environmental NGOs, we've really all come together and made some determinations that we really need to be super focused on carbon, and we need to be very focused on climate. And so that has led us into a place where a number of investments that we made 30 years ago, 25 years ago, that we expected to work for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, are being reconsidered. Next slide, please. So how are we reconsidering it? How are we financing these changes? What on earth is going on? Well, one of the tools that electric companies all across the country in 24 states, I believe, are utilizing is this tool called securitization. And securitization is really just the process of refinancing an asset and, in effect, restructuring that asset into debt. So I'll explain this a little bit by just giving an example. So say, the year's 1990, you're getting together with your public service commission, you're deciding and you're starting to look at population growth in and around Kansas City. And you're saying, okay, I'm going to need more electricity tomorrow than I need today. And, here's sort of what I expect population growth and energy use to look like. So we're going to go out and build some electric generating facilities to meet that future demand. You do it, you decide that you're going to finance a 1,000 megawatt coal plant for 40 years. The Public Service Commission agrees, you agree, and so you move forward. This thing is going to be paid for and fully depreciated in the year 2030. The electric company goes out and pays for that resource to be built immediately. And in effect, what the electric company is doing is financing that cost to customers. They're pushing these costs onto customers on a monthly basis, even though the cost of the asset was paid up front by the electric company. So the electric company is working a lot like a bank might, right? They have this return on equity, 7 to 9% that they will earn on this investment, which, if you think about it, it's in effect like the interest rate on that investment. Okay, so you start to move forward. You're living and operating with this particular coal plant, providing a bunch of electricity in and around Kansas City. Then, not all of a sudden, but then sort of customer expectations start to change a little bit. We start to get more and more focused on climate and begin to realize that, okay, maybe we do not want these particular coal plants to be a part of our energy future because of the carbon impact that they have. So we'd look at that asset and we would say, okay, the year's 2020, we've got 10 years remaining in the financing of that asset, meaning we still owe, what's that? 25% of the cost of this asset still has to be paid back from customers. And we would say, all right, well, maybe we need to move that asset from an asset to, in effect, a liability. So we'll take the last 10 years of financing, if we were given the securitization tool by the Public Service Commission, and we would restructure all of the remaining cash flows and create a debt instrument or a security, and then would sell those securities to investors. So in effect, that asset gets eliminated from the electric company's books that owned it, and it becomes owned by investors and who purchase the bonds, and those bonds are secured by sort of future payments for the remaining 10 years. So it's an interesting and I think useful tool when you're talking about restructuring an electric company asset. But if you could flip to the next slide. It's a really interesting tool, and that's kind of what it does as background. Here are all of the states that have, or I think all of the states, I'll ask Ron to see if I missed any, that have used securitization in the past. As you can see, a bunch of states in the left column have used it for stranded assets and then coal plant retirements into the second column. A few states have used securitization for storm costs. Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina. A bunch of costs are incurred as it relates to storm. Usually those costs are passed through to customers. Securitization is a great way to solve for that debt. And then in a few instances, and one that's my current favorite, the state of California just passed some legislation that would allow electric companies to securitize COVID costs. In this crazy period that we're living in, electric companies are incurring a bunch of new costs, be that PPE, putting one individual in a truck as opposed to two individuals in a truck, new sort of equipment that are requiring us to operate differently under these circumstances. And the state of California, in a pretty innovative piece of policy, decided to allow this vehicle to be utilized to cover all those costs. Next slide, please. All right, so securitization can be a useful tool, but it's not a panacea. All right, so there are a couple of things to think about, and I kind of I kind of got to it a little bit when I was explaining the securitization vehicle. The first part, and something that I think matters a lot for investors that made good faith investments 30, 40, 50 years ago, expecting to receive a return over the life of that asset. Securitization restructures that rate of return in effect for the remaining years of the project is either greatly diminished or removed altogether. Securitization as a tool, frankly, is not that different from bankruptcy and bankrupting a particular asset. In effect, you're restructuring future payments around it. So I think it's pretty notable that you're seeing just this number of electric companies fighting for legislation to be granted to the commission to utilize this tool because it's not a decision these companies can take lightly. Just because, in effect, I mean, we're in the business of making long-term investments and earning a return. And we're certainly willing to give because customer expectations are changing, but we need to figure out how we're going to be able to invest in other things in the future. And then the last point that I make here is just the effects of overuse of securitization. The problem it leads to are very it's sort of like poor management of balance sheets and poor management of revenues overall. So if you have a bunch of assets that you want to securitize and close, that's going to have a very material impact on your ability to raise capital as an electric company going forward, and it could put companies in a pretty difficult position. So I think it's one very critical tool to be considered, as a lot of these coal plants in particular are becoming more liabilities and are quickly becoming things that electric companies don't necessarily want to remain in. It's something that we should be thinking about, but it's, as I said, far from a panacea. Next slide, please. I think just another part to be considering as you're talking about, getting rid or eliminating existing resources. You just really need to be thoughtful about the community impact that retirement of these facilities are going to have. In a lot of instances, coal plant, nuclear plant, in particular, hydro plant in some parts of the Northwest are really the main source of tax revenue for a lot of these small communities. And when a retirement decision is made, the electric company that owns the facility has a responsibility to negotiate with all of the individuals that work at that facility to ensure that they still have a job or they get a package or whatever the case may be. And so the electric companies manage that, but there's kind of the induced impact that also needs to be considered. So if you have one individual that works in a family that works at the coal generating facility, and then say their spouse works at a neighboring restaurant or is a teacher at the local school, when that tax base leaves, when that facility leaves, there's a very real hole left. And this is a lot of what you hear talked about as the just transition conversation. Like, what do we do in these communities once these plants walk away? So there's that to be considered. There's the tax revenue. I talked about schools. These electric companies are pretty big taxpayers in these local communities. You've got to figure out how you're going to make up that lost revenue. And then as a last matter, you've got to figure out how you're going to make up for that lost generation. You're not living in a part of the country that's having severe population declines. So you've got to figure out how you're going to replace that asset, be it with renewable assets paired with maybe gas plants or other things that will ensure that you have uninterrupted access to electricity. Next slide, please. And there we are. I made it to the end. So I hope that was a little bit of an overview of securitization, how it works, and how electric companies think about it. I think it's a very useful tool and something that we should be granting commissions so they just have the ability and flexibility to do whatever is necessary to build the energy future that we want. But also need to appreciate that it's as I said before, not the only solution that exists out there, but a very good one. So with that, I'll turn it over back over to Josh.
Great. Thank you very much, Brad. Now, Ron, back to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Brad. That was a great setup for what I want to say. Really good introduction to securitization, and I'm glad you mentioned the just transition piece of it. Next slide. I want to spend a little bit of time talking in more depth about the tool and how it's used in context. And I realize the context is different every place, so I'm going to give you sort of generalized lessons that we've learned working with this idea in a lot of different circumstances around the country, but realize that your circumstances, wherever you happen to be, are going to be different and special and unique, and you have to adapt this stuff to those circumstances. So it's never a case of never or always. It's more nuanced than that. There are three things that I think are implications as I was thinking about talking to you today. One is that we probably could do a better job in the electric sector if we brought financial planning out of the sole control of utilities and made it a feature of our other planning. I mean, we spend a lot of time planning for new resources and reducing risk through planning exercises and so on. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but we don't do that. We don't do financial planning along with it. There's a financial transition that's being made here. And my thesis in part is that we would do a better job. We could create more benefits to be shared by everybody if we brought that financial transition and those issues forward and did them upfront and in a thoughtful and planned way. The utilities are definitely doing that, but the rest of us are not in on that conversation. So I think we should be. Second one, regulation proceeds through haltingly, typically through a series of different dockets, and we have to think about maintaining a strategy that runs through different kinds of dockets. That's one of the parts that's not too easy here. And then third, using securitization to address plant retirements is an ongoing reality. And Brad, I would add Michigan to the current use of that. Consumers Energy filed on September 18th for a $700 million securitization package for a plant retirement, and estimating a AAA bond rating for the three tenors of bonds they have in mind at 1.7%. So there's some very attractive money, low-cost debt around, and we should use that to ease the transition that we're in. The other thing I'd respond to Brad by saying is that we've looked at this more as an economic issue, because we found, I'm here in Colorado, and our experience with public service companies very strongly that the new resources have dropped in cost. Wind and solar in particular, and batteries have dropped in cost so much that they make running the old coal plants uneconomic. So if you believe in climate change or don't, that's fine. But if you believe in money, this is a way to save some money. And the faster you do it, the more you save. So this slide is really, I've titled this tongue-in-cheek, 4 easy pieces. I presented this enough to know that I can make your eyes roll back in your head by doing this, but I'll try to make it easy and make it seem easy at least. And I think there are 4 steps here, and this sort of surrounds the securitization in some of its context. We think that that financial analysis that I was talking about, based on a corporate financial model, just like Wall Street uses, and using publicly available financial data that's filed with SEC, FERC, and EIA, is a good way to go. Once you set up that financial model, it can serve you through this whole process of utility financial transition by showing you what the financial options are and what impact they have, not only on shareholders, but also on consumers. And we ought to be doing that heads up. We're going to use different financial tools at different times to do this. We have choices to make. They have impacts. Let's run them through the financial model and see what it looks like. So I'm arguing for broader use of utility financial model here. We use it in the work we do with utilities and around the country, starting here in Colorado and then going.
Ron, I'm sorry, Ron, you accidentally muted yourself there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Again, we use the financial model to derive the marginal cost of energy at the plant level, and then compare those plant level costs with new resources that can be acquired through bidding and competition, in our case here in Colorado. And by doing that, we can target the retirements to the most productive ends, taking the highest cost plants out first, basically. And typically those are the smaller, older ones. That's what's been happening, and I think that'll continue to happen. So with that financial analysis in hand, you realize that if you do make a decision to retire a plant early, you have that depreciation issue that Brad raised. You've got that money you need to pay off. The investment hasn't been paid down. Typically, utilities have been investing more in plants to keep them running. So you're dealing with a balance there that needs to be paid off. Disallowing that is a poor decision. It's a declaration of failure in my view, and we should avoid that. We should pay that money off so that we keep trust with our investors and they keep giving us a good deal on money. So how do you do that most effectively? Now, I probably differ a little bit from Brad in that the decisions made 30 or 40 years ago are not at issue here. It's the current decision making about when to retire. And our utility management's making good decisions. They've been paid in their risk premium to take those risks. And if there is no risk, if those 30, 40-year investments are guaranteed return, then maybe that equity risk premium has been too high for many decades. So there's got to be a risk, and it's got to be taken. It's got to be faced. How to handle it's the question. Depreciation is one of the tools, and I'll show you how that trades off with some of the other ones in a minute. And that feeds into a rate case, and the rate case is where the money comes down. So what I'm suggesting is, sort of step one is a planning exercise. Let's get in planning and develop the information that we need to make good decisions about a financial transition, and then carry that over into a rate case, carry that consensus that we achieve by getting the stakeholders together and doing good planning work. Let's carry that over into depreciation and rate cases where the money comes down. Once that decision is made, and this is a tricky place for a lot of people because they confuse or conflate securitization with a decision about how much should be recovered. It's depreciation and rate case that take up the questions of disallowance or partial disallowance or how much time it takes to get the money back, the depreciation schedule. That's rate case work. And once that's done, you can ask the question, okay, we know what needs to be paid back. How do we handle that? Is there a way to refinance it? And that's where securitized bonds come in. And Brad's absolutely correct to point out that takes the equity out, typically takes the equity earnings out on that regulatory asset that's been set up to handle the unpaid investment in an early retired plant. So that's a hit to shareholders. I'm a utility shareholder, full disclosure. And I prefer that not to happen. But if it's going to happen, I want something to balance that off. And so in the regulatory compact, we're looking for a balance of outcomes between shareholders and consumers, and consistent with reliability and viability and a bunch of other things. But we're looking for a balance, and to rebalance in favor of shareholders, we think that utilities should be allowed to own some of the replacement power that comes in to replace the early retired plant to refill their rate base. That's very good for shareholders. It's very easy to make a utility whole and more than whole by allowing them to own some, but not all of the replacement power. The reason that you don't want to have them own all of it is that would be an exercise of monopsony or monopoly power on the buyer's side. And that's not the right outcome. You want to have competition. You want to have the utility have a very sharp pencil and the competitors have a sharp pencil, and both of them end up beating each other's brains out to provide the best deals at the lowest cost for consumers. So those are the 4 steps. And we started out thinking about planning for a financial transition in the first step. And excuse me. And then at the last step, we're back in planning. So this is a cycle. So we're keeping our attention on this. We're cycling through these dockets and making this happen. And we think that there's a triple win outcome here. Consumers pay less because the retirement reduces fuel and O&M costs very substantially. They're typically hundreds of millions of dollars here. And the refinance savings going from the utility's authorized rate of return down to the AAA bond rating is another big savings. Again, it can amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is a big deal That makes it worth trying to keep a focus on this through all these steps. You get the lower emissions if you're interested in that. Clean energy is added. You got a lot of opportunities there. We have 4 Vestas wind plants manufacturing turbines here in Colorado today, and I recommend getting manufacturing facilities for the new stuff. That's a very good thing. And on the shareholder side, you get higher shareholder returns. You respond to your investors who want to see utilities making this happen. Take a look at what Morgan Stanley and BlackRock said back the first of the year about this. And you respond to those customers who are threatening to leave if they don't get cleaner power. There's a customer preference and customer defection issue that's a risk for utilities. You handle that. Down at the bottom of the slide, you can read more here. We've published a bunch of stuff about this in energy innovation. The first one of these will give you the thesis I've just given you, but in more detail. The second one, there are some best practices for how to do the replacement power dance. It's basically linking planning and procurement together. And the third one is a series of bright ideas. Energy innovation is, after all, a think tank, and these are some of the thoughts we've had. So next slide. Let me just spend a little time talking about, we call these knobs and levers, okay? So when you're dealing with securitization, that's one aspect of a financial transition. Here are some of the others, and there may be others that come up in your circumstances that you need to think through in this way. This is a slide that says we're not going to allow the utility to recycle that capital back into ownership and earn on it. So no capital recycling. And it compares impacts on the utility and impacts on customers. So if you have a disallowance, that's a very negative. Double X is a very negative on credit and equity for the utility, but customers like that a lot. So 2 check marks, short-term positive customer impact. You can vary the allowed rate of return. Debt only to WACC is what we suggested here, but there's plenty of options to make different choices here. Those are typically negative to the utility, but positive for consumers. You can accelerate depreciation. That causes rates to go up, so that's very negative for consumers. Or you can allow full utility finance. Utilities like that, so that's good for them, but customers not so much. Securitization takes the equity out of the regulatory asset flow, so that's a negative for a utility, but the customers like that. So let's take a look at the other slide, and my last slide, which is these same issues, but with capital recycling, allowing the utility to own some of the replacement power. Here again, disallowance, bad for utilities, good for customers. Rate of return, you can make a lot of different choices here. Accelerated depreciation, big rate impacts. Full utility finance, very good for utilities, not so good for customers. But securitization brings back the balance on behalf of the customers. So it's one tool in a package of tools. There are knobs and levers for each one of these. You can adjust these to fit your circumstance. But this is the kind of thinking that we think needs to take place to use securitization effectively. It's one tool in a toolbox. These are some of the other tools, and you may think of others that we haven't thought of or haven't considered. But this gives you an idea of the kind of trade-offs that can lead to those triple win outcomes. So that's my pitch, and thanks very much for listening to it.
Thank you, Ron. That was extremely enlightening. Very interesting. Our last speaker on this panel is Ashok with NRDC. Ashok.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
We hear you. We do not see you.
How about now?
Absolutely. There we go.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Great to be here, and really pleased that I'm following Brad and Ron, who did such a great job presenting this. I think they hit the nail on the head about how securitization is a really important tool, but there are a lot of other details that we need to focus on as we use the tool. But it's a tool we should have in our toolbox in both Missouri and Kansas, where I'm also working. So this is something that as you probably know, something I have focused on and prioritized in my advocacy at NRDC, because I do think it helps us deal with and make transition possible. And as Ron pointed out, and Brad did too, the transition's happening and are happening because of both environmental reasons, but also economic reasons. So to the extent you have resources now that are both cleaner and less expensive, we need to address this issue of legacy investments and how to make the transition, and also do it in a way that creates a win for both investors and customers. And I think securitization, properly used, properly managed, is a good tool to have. And that's why many of us have been working to get this tool in our toolbox in Missouri, and for me also in Kansas. Just a little background on where we are on the legislative side of things. The process started almost in 2018, spring, where legislation was first introduced in Missouri. And it was introduced first in Kansas in January of 2019. Missouri went on to have a hearing in spring of 2019, and the bill will be reintroduced and actually has been pre-filed as of December 1st here in Missouri as SB 202. We can come back to this, but the idea here is that there's a process, there's been engagement with lots of different stakeholders to kind of get the right balance in the legislation. 90% of the legislation is, of course, setting out the mechanics of how you do securitization and what's needed. A lot of lessons learned from what Colorado did, New Mexico did, what's been going on in other states. This is an issue that's been around, as Brad laid out in one of his slides, around all the different states that have used securitization for a long time. I first came across it in New York when New York was restructuring. And the transition back then was about how large customers especially saw lower cost resources. At that point, it was combined cycle natural gas plants, and wanted to make the transition happen. At that point, the issue was how to introduce competition and deregulation. I think of securitization being used here in Missouri and Kansas as getting the benefits of competition and deregulation without competition and deregulation, because those have their own downsides. So this allows you to make the transition and get the benefits to moving to lower cost and cleaner resources. And that's why, for me, focusing on this was a way to help make this transition happen. For the first few years when I moved here from New York, I noticed that we, especially on energy efficiency, we were not making the investments, and still aren't, even they were cost effective, because we had a lot of existing legacy investments. Even though they were more expensive, we couldn't replace them with lower cost efficiency resource. And that's happening more and more, even with renewable resources too. So in order to make this transition happen to lower cost resources, securitization as a policy and as a tool was something I felt was very, very important to start happening here in the Midwest. Lots of details in the legislation, but you should not get confused, even though it's a long, lengthy, complicated bill. Like I said, the policy pieces, we need to get some of those in the legislation, but a lot of them are left to the implementation phase, as Ron said, in rate cases and future proceedings, where the commission will have to issue a securitization order for securitization to be put in place. So we shouldn't get, get stuck in the legislative context around what we need to do then later on. The financial analysis Ron talked about, that's also happening, so we can look at this in more detail on a plant-by-plant basis, based on even public information, and soon that will be shared with lots of folks so people can look at this in more detail in terms of what this means. And from NRDC's perspective, again, what securitization and ratepayer-backed bonds do is really help us, again, make the transition, help deal with the concern around lower costs for customers and the need to move to cleaner resources. We need to do securitization, in our view, with capital recycling. We don't think it works without it, both for reliability reasons, cost reasons, utility investor reasons. So we see securitization as a piece of the puzzle. It helps deal with the regulatory assets, but it needs to be done in a way that works also for investors and balances the needs, of course, of customers at the same time. That's how you get the win-win-win. If we don't do it in a balanced way and think that we can get from Ron's last chart that the benefits should all go to customers or all go to utilities, we don't get either. So to make this work, there has to be awareness about what the utility and the investors need, and clearly what the customers must also see as a benefit. People often confuse this with accelerated depreciation, which this is not, because that would not be good from a customer perspective. So what this does is really allows the transition to take place, allows us to benefit from an economic perspective and an environmental perspective. And I'm hoping and hopeful that both Kansas and Missouri will pass this legislation this spring, and that we can then move towards the commission process and a rate case process to figure out how we best use this tool in our states. I will stop there and leave time for the conversation, Josh, because I'm sure there are a lot of good questions and comments from all the people you've assembled today.
Thank you, Ashok, very much. Brad, Ron, if you want to hop back on. We do have 4 questions so far. Nope, more than that. You are right. All right. So the first one, and if we feel that you've answered those, that's all right. But the first one wants to make sure, I want to make sure we address was, what happens to liability under securitization?
What kind of liability are we talking about? I mean, if it's the liability of the managers of the utility to provide profits and protect bond ratings, I think this is credit positive, at least according to Moody's. Securitization takes what could be a potentially stranded asset, an uneconomic or non-performing asset, and refinances it, so it cleans up the balance sheet. So I think from a investor perspective, it's probably a positive thing. If you look at what Morgan Stanley and BlackRock and many other financial institutions are saying, this is what investors want. They're going to be treating utilities that go down this road favorably. They're going to be recommending buying their stocks, and they're going to be supporting their bond ratings. And so I think the liability from that perspective is this is a way to manage that kind of liability. There's lots of other liabilities that we could talk about, but I like to take financial issues from an investor perspective. So that's how I'd respond to that part of it.
The only thing I'd add to that, I think I agree with most of what Ron said there, is you just have to pay attention to how much of it you're doing, and sort of how many plants on an individual balance sheet are being dealt with this way. Because it can be positive, but in fact, and I think the capital recycling thing's a really good point, right? Like you need asymmetric returns as you consider this. So like if you're going to get rid of one form of cash flow on an electric company's balance sheet, you need to replace it with another form of cash flow. And to the extent that it's kind of managed that way, I think you're right. I think it is credit positive, but if it's all just like elimination of future returns, I think there can be some negative impact. So like most things, case by case, I think the way that we've been talking about it here, I tend to agree with Ron. It's generally credit positive.
Yeah, I'd add that we did take up the question of substituting debt for equity in one of the issue papers that's posted on the Energy Innovations website that I gave you. And it really is the outside is the credit rating agencies looking at the debt equity ratio. So if there's room, and it's a circumstantial empirical question, if there's room to increase the debt, then it's an option that makes a lot of sense. If the rating agencies consider this to be off balance sheet, then it doesn't affect that. But you can also substitute corporate debt for corporate equity. That's another option. So there's lots of options here, and Brad's right. You got to take a look at this from a financial perspective. How are the equity guys and debt rating agencies going to treat this? And that's what your financial model helps you do. So absolutely right.
Great. Some would think that a lot of the conversations or presentations you're having right now deal with the investor-owned utilities. Eric Hempel asked, how does the securitization analysis change when coal facilities are owned by, say, multiple utilities, municipal utilities, or co-ops? Does it matter if it's regulated versus unregulated?
So this is Ashok. I mean, clearly we could apply this tool. I think the legislation so far has been focused on investor-owned utilities. I think it's hard enough to do with investor-owned utilities, but one could do it, in my view, with munis and co-ops. But it would require probably a different approach in terms of how we, do these ratepayer-backed bonds. So short answer is it could be done. There are not a lot of great examples so far. It's really about how one wants to refinance those obligations that people have through long-term contracts, and what is where do you apply the instrument of being able to pay back those bonds, and what kind of legal agreements can you reach among multiple munis and co-ops in terms of how those bonds will be paid back. So in my view, it could be done. It's something I would love to have a conversation with folks about, but my view is let's do it in steps. Let's do the IOU part first, and then let's also start thinking about munis and co-ops. Ron, you may have experience with this elsewhere, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, we count the response of Long Island Power Company under some New York legislation as an example of a muni refinancing or a public utility refinancing with securitized bonds. That was kind of a special, it was post-Sandy recovery situation. But, in principle, this could be done depending on what kind of bond ratings the muni or co-op has, and what's the comparison to today's AAA rated, and can you create the kind of security with action by a board or a municipal entity that you can through a regulatory compact under state legislation. That's really the comparison. So it hasn't been done much, but it's possible, I think, to look at. It's an empirical question. Where are you in the bond cycle? What's the comparison between your bonds and AAA rated?
You may have to create some sort of a state authority to kind of hold this and have a contractual relationships to be able to collect them, so as to kind of deal with the Long Island situation with Long Island Power Authority was much bigger entity and already a public authority doing it versus a lot of smaller munis and co-ops. So my view would be you would have to do some aggregation and some state authority created to serve that function of being able to issue those bonds and then collect from multiple munis and co-ops, and also renegotiate power, old contracts and power purchase agreements at the same time. So it can be done. It's just complicated. So this question always comes up when we had the hearing in Jeff City a couple of years ago. This was one of the most important questions we got. So I understand the interest, given the state's profile in terms of non-IOU electricity mix. So we can come back to this, Josh, but we should probably move on, given that you have other questions.
Understand, absolutely, we do. Sticking on what you just said, Ashok, there was a question. Can you tell us, is there any high-level changes from last year's legislation to this year's version?
There will be. We don't have it yet, but stay tuned. So what was introduced was the same bill, but as we get agreement among multiple parties around it changes, there will be a new version introduced probably before there is a committee hearing.
So there was a question about customer preference. Said it was mentioned as a driver for securitization. In monopoly markets, the potential impact customers have is limited. What useful structures and tactics are available to change this dynamic?
Well, I'm going to reject the premise a little bit because I tend to think that customer demand actually drives everything. And for anyone who's been involved in a regulatory proceeding, you understand that there are the regulators themselves who are pushing back and fighting on behalf of customers, and then you've got consumer advocates, and frankly, a lot of us that are here, right? I know that Ashok's organization will be involved. Ron has been involved in rate proceedings advocating for these various things. So there are a bunch of proxies there that are sort of utilizing customer sentiment and applying it in these legal proceedings to say that, hey, this thing needs to change, particularly here, when we're making decisions about climate. I think one thing that we've got to remember, and there's been some discussion about the benefits of wholesale markets that was kind of touched upon earlier. The interesting thing about wholesale markets is wholesale markets are designed to deliver the least cost resource and nothing else. There are other sort of structures, renewable portfolio standards, or other sort of policies that can be passed at the state level that will require say renewable resources to be selected, even if they're more expensive than fossil resources. So the thing that you have in the regulatory structure is the state just gets to determine what it wants. And the State Public Service Commission gets to kind of make that decision, in effect, unilaterally. And I think that's sort of how control is managed, and that's sort of how some of these a lot of these decisions can be made. You have to do more policy in a restructured market on top of it to ensure that those particular outcomes are delivered. It's like, for example, Missouri, wind would be very cheap, solar might not be as cheap, and it might not be able to compete with gas. And so you sort of have to understand where you're sitting and what the price of resources are in your particular community.
I'd add one other aspect here. I very much agree with what Brad said, but the FANG companies, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, and companies like that are absolutely avid for this. They want to see this transition happen, and if they don't get it from the utility, they're going to have their code writers go off and write some software that'll allow them to disrupt the electric utility industry, so you won't recognize it. That's what they do, and they're doing it. And so it's I think a real challenge for utilities to respond. They can respond or not, it's up to them. But if they do, then they can keep those customers on their side and in the mix. If not, they'll go someplace else. They'll find a way to go someplace else. That's a big challenge.
So Josh, the only thing I would add to this equation, just people understand, I mean, some customers choosing, as Ron says, is happening. The question is really, do we want all customers to be able to benefit from clean energy and have this transition take place, and how not to shift costs by those customers that choose cleaner power should not necessarily be shifting costs to all other customers. So part of the challenge here is, choice sounds good until you ask the question, are you shifting costs? If you're not shifting costs and you want everybody to benefit from cleaner resources, we would like to see the whole system become much, much, much cleaner for everybody, and the economic benefits be shared with everybody. Because if the new resources, cleaner resources, are cheaper, why should only some people benefit from it? That's why we need to make this transition happen in a way that all can benefit. The pressure by some to want clean energy is not going to go away. That's just going to be another reason why we need to make this transition. But from a regulatory perspective, you want that choice, if it's economic choice, to be available to all customers. So, to me, large customers choosing is good pressure on the system, because it means there are lower cost resources out there that we should be moving towards. We still have to deal with the regulatory assets, the stranded cost issue, because if some customers opt out, those costs then are borne by those that remain on the system. Obviously, that gets dealt with in a rate case and many other things, as Ron talked about it. Nothing is finalized or decided, but just want to put in the context of where choice fits in terms of benefits and costs, and it doesn't remove. I mean, securitization came about first when we deregulated electricity markets, because the issue of stranded costs did not disappear. The delta between, costs that were, book value versus market value does not go away whether you deregulate whether you have choice or whether you have vertically integrated market trying to make transitions. You still have to deal with the difference between book and market value of the generation mix. And so you have multiple choices politically. I think securitization is the best of those options because it lets you balance all those interests. Otherwise, you're stuck in a political food fight and you get nothing.
Can I say amen, Ashok, for whatever it's worth? Amen. I agree with everything you said there.
So, and I might have missed this, so I apologize. Does the securitization have any impact on the winding down of that facility? You know, thinking the environmental impact, the tearing down, or that type of stuff. Is that in the details that you had mentioned there, Ashok? That once the legislation's passed, that the utility, the PSC handle. What happens to that part?
Yeah, I mean, clearly those costs associated with decommissioning, and obviously we talked about the just transition related costs. I mean, there are a lot of things that we have to deal with. And to me, this divvying up of the pie and the benefits is an important conversation and all the obligations you still have. But we shouldn't get sidetracked on all those details, important details, and lose sight of the fact that what you're creating with securitization is real benefits. Access, getting low-cost financing compared to the utility cost of capital gives you real benefits that you need to then apportion and deal with all of the different things you need to deal with because you're making this transition. And as one of the people I talked to who was one of the first to do a securitization deal back in New York, he says, don't forget to remind people always that with securitization, you're creating real value. How you want to create that, use that real value is the process of creating a securitization order and rate cases. And so one of them is, you clearly have obligations in terms of cleanup that you'll have to deal with. So those are costs associated with commissioning that one has to, address as part of the process in terms of a cost and an obligation and the liabilities that was mentioned. So yeah, I mean, I think there's lots to do, but again, people shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, all those cliches. We need to move forward here so we can use this tool to make the transition and get the benefits and deal with all the details. But right now, the key is to, in my view, let's get the policy on the books.
I could add just one other notion to that idea, and that's that these sites where plants are going to be decommissioned and the sites are going to be remediated could potentially have a lot of value. There's a lot of electrical focus there. There's a lot of equipment. Might be a great place to put a server farm, for example. And so the question of how much do you remediate the site for what use seems to me like a really good planning question. It's part of the financial transition. What could be made out of this site? How much value does it have? If we remediate it fully and completely and soon, could it be an asset instead of a liability? Those are kinds of questions that you could take up in planning. And if you had, a good plan that would survive its trip through all these different regulatory dockets, then, you're creating additional value, both for the utility and the society that it serves.
And Josh, one point before we all, people should remember that the reason we're having this conversation and the need for a transition, we shouldn't forget that over the last 10 years, how much costs of clean energy solutions have declined. Wind, photovoltaics, batteries, LEDs have all come down like 90% in the last 10 years. So what Brad was saying, when we were doing our planning 10, 15, 20 years ago, we could have projected these costs, but now we have real world examples of those costs having declined. People want to benefit from those cleaner resources that are lower cost. So this is not, what changed was technology happened, costs came down, alternatives are cheaper. We're just trying to deal with the question of how do you deal with a system where you have investments that are made long-term that are no longer the right path forward. And so to me, that's always going to be the case. Every 10, 20, 30 years, we'll have a whole new set of things that are better. And this is a tool that helps you deal with it. And one last thing, we know we're talking a lot about coal plants and change of resources, but we should not forget this being a tool for managing of other costs. So going back to storm cost recovery, fire in California, COVID costs. To me, there are a lot of costs we need to manage in the system. Some of our unanticipated new costs that fall on customers. So to me, this is not just about coal plant retirements. This is about transitions generally and cost management overall, and how with the right financial analysis and mix do you achieve your reliability goals, manage cost for customers, and yes, bring in the lower cost resources that are now available to us.
That was fantastic. Thank you, all three of you. That was very interesting. I know personally, it's been a topic I've wanted to learn a lot more about for the reasons that the show brought forward. That is definitely an issue that's being discussed in Missouri. So I hope all of you found it as valuable and interesting as I did. So Brad, Ron, Ashok, thank you very much. Greatly appreciate it. Hopefully you could stay on, participate, because part of Ashok's last point there as we move forward was, and Ron's as well, is if the market isn't responding as is, customers will find a different way to get what they want. And that next session, our next session here, is on virtual purchase power agreements.